From colony to voice, the evolution of English in Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Hello, everyone. I apologize, I'm a little under the weather and nervous about doing this, but here we go. This project looks at how English traveled to three colonial settings and evolved into something distinct in each one. The three countries, one shared British root, three different outcomes. We'll move through colonial origins, colonization, phonology, language contact, and identity, building the full picture as we go. My overall thesis. My thesis breaks down to one sentence. Canada, Australia, and South Africa all started from British English, but ended up somewhere genuinely different. And we can trace why through linguistics. The 5 sections here are the backbone. Think of them as building blocks on each other. You can't understand the sound without understanding the settlement, and you can't understand the identity without understanding the sound. This kind of comparative study is exactly what the history of the English language course is about. English isn't one static thing. It's a living system that bends to its context. The scholars grounding this work, Boberg, Hickey, Moore, and Mestre, are all major names in the world English's research. Peer-reviewed, published by Cambridge and Oxford, they create a solid academic foundation. Colonial origins. This is our starting point. Where does each variety come from? The 3 key dates to keep in mind are 1760s for Canada, 1788 for Australia, 1820 for South Africa. These aren't arbitrary. The timing of settlements shaped who came, why they came, and what dialects they brought with them. Canada gets English through conquest and loyalist migration. Australia through a penal colony, South Africa through trade, and then deliberate settlers programs. 3 very different founding stories that shaped everything that comes after. 3 colonial starting points. Canada's English story is complicated by the fact that French was already there, being spoken. The Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution brought a huge influx of English, but they were moving into a bilingual space from day one. Australia is fascinating because the founding population were convicts and soldiers, not gentry, not uniform dialect speakers. Right from 1788, you had a massive dialect diversity crammed onto one continent. South Africa had layers of colonialism, Dutch first, then British. So English arrived at an environment where Afrikaans was already established, where there were dozens of African languages, the most complex contact situation of the 3. All 3 share one thing. English didn't arrive in a vacuum. It immediately had to coexist with other languages and dialects, and that's what makes each variety so unique. Colonization and dialect leveling. This is the core linguistic process, the mechanism that explains how colonial English is formed. The term coin comes from Greek. It was used to describe the common dialect of ancient Greek that emerged after Alexander's conquests spread the language across the diverse populations. Same principles apply here. What's counterintuitive about coinization is that it doesn't produce a mess. It tends to produce something surprisingly orderly. The new dialect that emerges is usually simpler and more regular than any of its inputs. Hickey's framework is the theoretical backbone of this whole presentation. His edited volume, Legacies of Colonial English, is basically the field's Bible for this topic. The colonization process. Think of the 5 stages on this slide as a recipe. Mixing transitions to leveling, moves into simplification, progressing into reallocation, and finally into new norm. Mixing is what happens in the first generation. Everyone's talking to each other with different accents and dialects. Leveling is the key one. Really marked regional features like a strong Yorkshire vowel or a thick Scottish burr get smoothed out because they mark you as being from somewhere specific, which isn't useful in a new place where everyone is from somewhere specific. Reallocation is the subtle one. Features that survive don't just stick around randomly, they take on new social meanings. The sound might start to signal class, region, or attitude within the new variety. The third generation rule is important. Stablecoins typically don't fully emerge until grandchildren of the original settlers are speaking. That's roughly 60 to 80 years post settlement. Notice the different outcomes. Australia is remarkably uniform across its entire continent. South Africa ended up with multiple community-specific coins rather than one national one. That tells you something about how different the social structures were. Phonological signatures. Now we get into the sounds. This is the most concrete, demonstrable part of the presentation. Phonology is often where people first notice that a dialect is different. Before you can identify a word or a grammar pattern, you hear an accent. Each of the three varieties has signature phonological features, things linguists can point to and say, that's distinctively Canadian, or that's Australian. We'll go through one per country. Canadian English. Canadian raising is the star of the show here. It's subtle, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The key A vowel in about sounds different from the I in abide, even though they look like the same sound. Before the voiceless consonant, the vowel starts higher in the mouth. This is why Canadians sometimes sound like they're saying a boot to the American ear. They're not actually saying that, but the raised starting point of the vowel sounds different. Boberg's research is careful to point out this also distinguishes Canadian from American English. Most Americans don't have the raising pattern. The cot, C-O-T versus C-A-U-G-H-T merger is shared with most North America. Cot and cot sound the same, but the jus retention after dentals is more British flavored. It marks Canadian as distinct from American. Australian English. The three-tier system is something you don't usually see spelled out so clearly in other Englishes. It's very distinctively Australian. Broad, general, and cultivated aren't just accent strengths, they carry social meaning. Broad is working class, rural authenticity. Cultivated was historically associated with wanting to sound British. General is what most Australians sound like day to day. The vowel shift is dramatic if you look at broad Australian. Face sounds almost like fleece. Sounds almost like flice. These significant departures from British input. Moore's point about 80 years to stable accent is important. It took about 3 generations post 1788 for Australian English to settle into something consistent. The uniformity across the continent is remarkable given how vast Australia is. In the US and the UK, you get enormous regional variations over similar distances. Australia leveled much faster. South African English. South Africa is the most complex of the three because you don't have one South African English. You have at least 4 community varieties, each shaped by different contact languages. We're going to define Safre as South African English and use Safre moving forward through the presentation. We have White Safre, Black Safre, Cape Flats English, and Indian Safre. They're all phonologically quite different from each other. This reflects the social stratification of the South African society, particularly under apartheid. The kip vowel split is subtle but consistent. The same vowel sound behaves differently in different phonological environments. The bath/trap distinction is interesting because South Africa kept a distinction that North American English is largely lost, more conservative in that sense. The click consonant borrowing from Nguni languages is remarkable. Clicks are extremely rare in Indo-European languages, and their appearance in Black Safre is a genuine contact-induced innovation. 11 official languages. That context alone tells you why English here had to share space in a way that it didn't have to in Canada or Australia. Language contact. Language contact is where the real flavor of each variety comes from. This is what gives Australian English kangaroo and South African English Ubuntu. We've talked in class about how contact works, borrowing code, code switching, substrate effects on grammar and phonology. All of that is happening in these three cases. The difference between lexical borrowing and structural influence matters a lot here. Some contact relationships go deep, others stay on the surface. Language contact. Canada's contact with French is unique because it's ongoing and politically institutionalized bilingual federal policy, official language status, active French language communities. This isn't just historical, it's in present tense. The indigenous loanwords in Canadian English cluster heavily in nature terms and place names moose, muskeg, kayak, but the structural influence on English grammar was minimal. Australia's Aboriginal borrowings follow the same pattern. Flora, fauna, place names kangaroo, wallaby, uluru. Moore notes the borrowing was concentrated early and was largely lexical. South Africa is the outlier. The contact with Afrikaans went beyond vocabulary into grammar, and the substrate effects of Bantu languages on Black Safari phonology go deep. Fanagalo, as a mining pigeon, is a great example of a full contact language emerging from necessity. Robot, meaning traffic light in South Africa in English, is one of my favorite examples, completely opaque if you don't know the context or contact history. National identity. This is where linguistics meets politics and may be the most relevant section for our class's bigger question about language and power. We talked about prescriptivism versus descriptivism, and about how standard languages get made and who benefits. All that applies here. The question of English is correct or prestigious is never just linguistic. It's always social and political. These three countries have had to navigate the question differently. Language, prestige, and national pride. Canada's story is quiet but real. Canadians often don't think of themselves as having a distinct accent. They'd say, I just speak normal English. But Boberg's research shows the distinct Canadian features are getting stronger in younger speakers, not disappearing. Australia had a more dramatic shift. The broad accent was actively stigmatized in the early 20th century, associated with the uneducated or lower class speaker. By the 1970s and 80s, as Australian culture confidence grew, that flipped entirely. Broad became a badge of authentic Australianness. South Africa is the most politically charged. Post-apartheid, Black Safari speakers aren't trying to sound like white Safari. They're innovating in their own direction, which Mesri reads as a form of linguistic resistance and self-determination. The shared trajectory deference to British progressive assertion of local identity mirrors the political decolonization. Language and national identity move together. This is a comparative table summary. The table is the at-a-glance version of everything I've covered so far, useful for seeing the patterns across the three varieties side by side. A few things do stand out, though. Australia has the highest coined uniformity of the three. That rapid leveling we talked about. South Africa has the lowest because these social divisions meant different communities developed separate varieties. The identity trajectory row is interesting. Canada is quiet independence. They have it. They just don't always claim it. Australia's is post-colonial pride from 1970s. South Africa's is contested deeply and political, especially post-1994. All four scholarly sources are represented here. This maps the research directly onto the comparative framework. Notice the settlement dates are all within a 6-year window, 1760s to 1820. These are roughly contemporary colonial projects, which makes the divergence even more striking. And in conclusion, we have a shared root of three distinct voices. I'm going to bring it back to the thesis. Same mechanisms, different outcomes. Coinization, dialect, leveling, language, contact. These are universal processes. What makes each variety distinct is the specific inputs. Who settled when, with what dialects, alongside what other languages. Hickey's framework holds up across all three cases, which gives this comparative analysis its coherence. It's not three separate stories, it's one story told three ways. The identity point is worth lingering on. English is no longer just Britain's language. These national varieties have staked their own claims. That's the broader arc of English history, from a small Germanic dialect on an island to a global language that belongs in different forms to billions of people. I really appreciate you guys hearing and listening to my presentation. This is my second time recording it because the first time it didn't record my audio. I can't wait to see everyone else's. Thank you.